That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back in an all-new series on CBS All Access.
What if I told you that one episode of The Twilight Zone was banned for over 5 decades, silenced, hidden, and completely erased from TV history? Now, after 55 long years, it's finally being shown again. But why was it banned in the first place? What made it so dangerous? And why does it matter right now more than ever? Today, we're stepping into a dimension of censorship, fear, and redemption. A true story that's stranger than fiction. Welcome to The Twilight Zone. Section 1. Entering the Zone, a show ahead of its time. In 1964, one episode of The Twilight Zone was aired once and then vanished. It was locked away for over 55 years, left out of syndication, hidden from public view, and quietly erased from the show's legacy. Why? What was in that episode that made it too dangerous to ever show again? And why is it being brought back now, in 2025? To understand that, we need to go back to where it all began. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS on October 2, 1959, and unlike anything else on television, it didn't follow a recurring cast or linear story. It was an anthology. Each week, a new tale, a new set of characters, and a new descent into the strange, the speculative, and the morally challenging. What connected them all was a quiet, unnerving voice. Rod Serling, who wrote or co-wrote 92 of the show's 156 episodes and narrated every chilling twist starting from episode 2. His delivery was calm and clear, but behind the calm, there was always warning. The show came at a time when America was riding the highs of post-war prosperity, while privately fearing nuclear annihilation, communist infiltration, and civil unrest. Serling, a World War II veteran who had seen real horror, wasn't interested in escapism. His writing pulled viewers into stories that probed fear, guilt, injustice, and the unknown. He knew people were scared, not just of aliens or monsters, but of themselves. And he used that fear, not to manipulate, but to ask, what kind of world are we building? Who gets to survive in it? Who gets erased? The Cold War loomed large in many episodes. So did McCarthyism, the Red Scare, the arms race, and the haunting question of whether humanity deserved to endure. In one famous episode, Time Enough at Last, a book-loving man survives a nuclear apocalypse, only to lose his glasses and be left unable to read. In The Shelter, suburban friends turn against each other in minutes when faced with a nuclear threat. These weren't just cautionary tales, they were reflections of what Serling saw around him, packaged in sci-fi so they could slip past the people who would otherwise shut them down. That was the genius of The Twilight Zone. Serling used speculative fiction, stories involving time travel, aliens, robots, parallel universes, as a kind of shield. He said things that couldn't be said in a straightforward drama. Network censors were more lenient if the story was set on Mars, even if it was really about racism in Alabama. Sponsors were less likely to object to a mutant child controlling a town if the real point was about authoritarianism and control. He disguised real social critiques in futuristic packaging. And for a while, it worked, but not always. Serling's earlier career had been defined by frustration. In 1956, a live TV drama he wrote called Noon on Doomsday, meant to depict the death of Emmett Till, was censored so heavily it lost all meaning. Network executives changed the victim from a black boy in Mississippi to an anonymous foreigner, fearing backlash from Southern affiliates and sponsors. Serling was furious. The Twilight Zone became his way of taking back control. Still, even in the relative freedom of the Twilight Zone, Serling had limits. CBS was nervous about his increasingly political tone. Ratings were never explosive, and sponsors sometimes dropped out mid-season. And then came the episode that crossed the invisible line. It was called The Encounter. Aired only once, in May 1964, The episode starred Neville Brand as a bitter World War II veteran and a young pre-Star Trek George Takei as a Japanese-American man. The entire story takes place in one room, and the episode ends in violence. It's uncomfortable, intense, and in hindsight, brilliantly written. But at the time, CBS was flooded with complaints. Viewers called it offensive and dangerous, while Asian American groups condemned the suggestion that Takei's father was a traitor. The country wasn't ready to face its own wartime actions. CBS pulled the episode from syndication. For decades, the encounter vanished from cable, DVDs, and public memory. But why now? Why, after 55 years, is this episode being allowed back into circulation? That's the story we're going to explore next. Because the answer isn't just about one TV episode, it's about history, memory, censorship, and the long fight to bring uncomfortable truths back into the light. Section 2. The Encounter. The episode they tried to bury. For over half a century, this episode was missing. Not lost, not forgotten, buried. Executives pulled it from reruns, home releases skipped over it, and even dedicated fans were left in the dark. But now, in one of the most unexpected moves in recent media history, The Encounter is back. Not a remake, not a sanitized version. The original, uncut, long-banned episode, finally re-aired in full in 2016, and now returning to wide release in 2025. How could an episode of a show like The Twilight Zone, which was built on moral discomfort and difficult truths, be too controversial even for its standards? And what exactly did this quiet, 25-minute bottle episode get so right and so wrong that it was removed from circulation for 55 years? Let's start with the basics. The Encounter aired on May 1st, 1964, during the show's fifth and final season. It was one of only 4 bottle episodes ever produced by The Twilight Zone, a term used in television to describe a story that takes place entirely in one confined location with a very limited cast, typically to save on budget. But despite its minimalist setup, The Encounter delivers one of the most intense, psychologically layered, and socially explosive stories in the entire series. It opens in an attic. Neville Brand, playing a World War II veteran named Fenton, is sorting through old junk. He comes across a samurai sword, clearly looted from a Japanese soldier. Moments later, a young Japanese-American man named Arthur, played by George Takei in one of his earliest TV roles, enters the attic looking for work. Fenton offers him a beer, and the two begin a conversation that at first seems casual, even friendly. But this isn't just a chat between strangers. What unfolds is a slow-motion detonation of trauma, guilt, and suppressed rage. Fenton starts reminiscing about the war, about killing Japanese soldiers, and about how he earned that sword. Arthur tries to keep the peace, but something's off. He stares at the sword a little too long. He repeats phrases with strange intensity. And then he drops the first bombshell. His real name is Taro, and his father, he says, was a spy for Imperial Japan who helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. From here, the atmosphere tightens like a noose. Fenton becomes paranoid. He's not just haunted by what he did in the war. He begins to suspect Arthur is there for revenge. Arthur, meanwhile, grows more volatile. He suggests the sword has a spirit, that it wants blood. There's no monster, no ghost, no alien, just 2 men trapped in a room, neither willing to leave, both carrying decades of psychological warfare inside them. So why did this episode provoke such an extreme reaction? On the surface, it might seem obvious. CBS and its sponsors were worried about alienating viewers, especially Asian American audiences, by depicting Arthur's father as a traitor. This wasn't just a throwaway line. It was a central plot point. It implied that a Japanese-American man living on U.S. soil had aided in the most devastating military attack on the country in modern history. And this was being broadcast in 1964, at a time when the U.S. government had barely begun acknowledging the full scale of its own crimes against Japanese-American citizens during World War II. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps after the attack on Pearl Harbor. These were not enemy combatants. These were families, shopkeepers, children, teachers, locked up because of their race. The government had justified the internment with vague claims of national security, but in reality, there was never any evidence of mass disloyalty or espionage. And in 1964, that truth had still not been fully acknowledged. To air an episode where a Japanese-American character confirms that his father was a spy, that was seen as inflammatory, even dangerous. But what the critics and censors missed, or perhaps refused to see, was that the encounter wasn't just about scapegoating. It was about complicity, about the long shadows cast by war. Fenton, the white veteran, isn't portrayed as a noble hero. He's unstable, possibly dangerous, and clearly consumed by shame. He admits that he killed an unarmed soldier, possibly in cold blood, and took the sword as a trophy. He's haunted not just by the war, but by what the war turned him into. Arthur isn't a clear-cut victim either. His confession about his father is filled with ambiguity. Is it true? Is it something he was told as a child and came to believe? Is he confronting Fenton with a literal truth or a metaphorical one, trying to explain what it means to grow up in a country that locked you behind barbed wire and then told you to be grateful? Even the sword, which Arthur claims carries a spirit, could be read either as a supernatural force or as a symbol of the violence passed from one generation to the next. None of this was spelled out directly. And that was the problem. The episode offered no easy answers, no moral clarity. In a time when television preferred clear heroes and villains, the encounter left everyone feeling uncomfortable, including CBS. Viewer complaints rolled in immediately. Sponsors threatened to pull support. Some claimed the episode was racist. Others said it was anti-American. Still others said it was too intense for prime time. Internally, CBS executives were panicked. The show was already on thin ice due to declining ratings and rising production costs. Rather than defend the episode, or Serling's right to push boundaries, they quietly pulled the encounter from syndication. When the Twilight Zone entered reruns, cable marathons, home video, and eventually streaming, the encounter was missing. It became a kind of myth. Fans passed around grainy VHS bootlegs. Some believed it had been destroyed. Others thought the controversy had been exaggerated. George Takei, who had experienced internment himself as a child, rarely spoke about it, until decades later when he became an outspoken advocate for civil rights and historical memory. Then, in 2016, something changed. Sci-Fi Channel, which had acquired the rights to air a full Twilight Zone New Year's Eve marathon, made a surprising announcement. The encounter would be aired for the first time since 1964. No edits, no disclaimers, just the original episode, inserted into the broadcast like it had never been missing. The response was immediate. Longtime fans were stunned. Younger viewers, many of whom had never heard of the episode, were shaken by its rawness. Some praised its honesty. Others still found it disturbing. But almost everyone agreed. This was one of the most powerful stories the series had ever told. Section 3. Why the encounter still matters today. Why does an episode that aired in 1964 still hit so hard today? Why does The Encounter, a quiet two-character drama shot in a single attic, feel more emotionally dangerous now than entire seasons of modern prestige television? The answer lies not just in what the episode shows, but in what it makes us admit about ourselves. Because this story, though wrapped in the visual language of a mid-century TV play, is about something we're still reckoning with. The long aftershocks of war, the failures of historical memory, and the way guilt, both personal and collective, gets passed down like a family heirloom. When The Encounter first aired, few viewers knew that George Takei had lived the very experience his character alluded to. As a child, He and his family were taken from their home and sent to the Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas, one of 10 internment camps built by the U.S. government after the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had committed no crimes. They were not charged. They were never given a trial. They were imprisoned because they were Japanese American. Takai was 5 years old when soldiers arrived at his door. He has spoken since then about what it meant to live through that kind of state-sanctioned injustice. Watching your parents lose their jobs, your family lose its home, being labeled enemy for no reason other than your ethnicity. He remembered guards pointing guns at him as a child. He remembered his father trying to shield him from the truth. That experience didn't just shape his identity, it shaped his politics. George Takei became an outspoken advocate for civil rights, gay rights, and especially for preserving the history of internment. And that makes his role in the encounter all the more complicated. In the episode, Takei's character doesn't just remember internment, he admits something terrifying. That his father was a spy, that he helped plan Pearl Harbor, that maybe, just maybe, the internment wasn't entirely unjustified. Whether we believe him or not, the damage is done. The character becomes a stand-in for a kind of inherited treachery, a racialized guilt that can never be washed away. And Fenton, the white veteran, becomes the other side of that coin. A man who killed in war, possibly committed war crimes, and took a sword as a souvenir of death. Both men are shaped by violence. Both are trapped by it. This is where Serling's writing is at its most dangerous. He refuses to give us a villain. Instead, he gives us two men who are both victims and both aggressors. Arthur is the child of a family brutalized by its own country, but his bitterness pushes him towards self-destruction. Fenton is a soldier haunted by what he did overseas, but his racism and paranoia make him incapable of peace. There is no safe position for the audience to occupy. You can't root for one without confronting the faults of the other. That ambiguity is the entire point. Rod Serling was a master of stories that forced viewers to sit with contradiction. In other episodes, he tackled totalitarianism, nuclear war, and bigotry, but always with a moral twist that refused easy judgment. With The Encounter, he went even further. He created a space where war trauma, national shame, and racial anxiety bled into each other without clear lines. That's why the episode was so hard to watch in 1964, and that's why it still matters now. The truth is, the world we live in today is not all that different. Over the past few years, there has been a documented rise in anti-Asian hate crimes, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the United States, Asian American citizens have been blamed, harassed, and assaulted simply for being perceived as foreign. People born and raised in America have been told to go back to China. Women have been attacked on subways. Elderly men have been shoved to the ground and killed. And just like during World War II, fear and misinformation have been used to justify that hate. In that context, The Encounter doesn't feel dated. It feels eerily familiar. The dynamic between Arthur and Fenton is not just a historical one. It's a blueprint for how racial trauma works in the modern world. Fenton's paranoia mirrors the suspicion many Americans still direct toward immigrants or those they see as other. Arthur's internalized shame mirrors the guilt and anger many marginalized people are forced to carry, not just because of what happened to them, but because of how they're told to feel about it. In a strange way, the attic becomes a symbol of a larger national attic, full of things we haven't dealt with, things we keep boxed up, things that come back when we least expect them. And then there is the question of apology. The U.S. government didn't formally apologize for the internment of Japanese Americans until 1988, over 4 decades after it happened. That apology came in the form of the Civil Liberties Act, signed by President Ronald Reagan, which acknowledged that the internment was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Survivors were given symbolic compensation, But a signature on paper doesn't erase the experience. It doesn't stop it from repeating in different forms. That's why the encounter still matters, because it dramatizes something that history books struggle to convey. What it feels like to be permanently marked by violence, to be unable to step outside of it, to find yourself reenacting it even when you want to escape. The sword in the attic is not just a weapon. It's a metaphor for inherited damage. It doesn't just belong to Fenton, it belongs to both of them. And by the end of the episode, the attic has become a kind of purgatory, a place where accountability, grief, and revenge circle each other without end. Isn't that the world we live in now? One where people are still fighting over who gets to tell the story, who gets to define guilt, who gets to be the victim. What Serling understood, far ahead of his time, is that trauma doesn't obey timelines. It doesn't resolve neatly. It lingers, mutates, infects relationships, reshapes identities, and unless it's brought out into the open, it poisons everything. That's why the return of the encounter is so important, because it's not just a banned episode being unbanned. It's a reminder of what storytelling can do when it isn't afraid to offend. It shows us what happens when we let art reflect complexity instead of flattening it. It dares us to look at our worst instincts and see where they come from. Section 4. The Long Shadow of Censorship, Other Lost Episodes. What does it say about a TV show when entire episodes disappear? Not because they were poorly made, but because they were considered too complicated to show again. Not offensive in the obvious way, not full of slurs or scandal, just hard to handle. If the encounter was the most famously buried episode of The Twilight Zone, it was far from the only one. Over the years, multiple episodes were removed from syndication, held back from home video, or outright forgotten, not because they were failures, but because they sat too close to something America wasn't ready to face. When The Twilight Zone went into syndication in the 1960s and 70s, the goal was to make it palatable for wide re-airing. That meant cutting episodes that caused legal headaches, offended sponsors, or simply made station managers nervous. 5 episodes, in particular, were left out of the original syndication package. One was The Encounter. The others were Miniature, A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain, Sounds and Silences, and An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Each was removed for a different reason, but together they paint a picture of a media environment where the boundaries of acceptable storytelling were constantly shifting and often arbitrary. Miniature, starring a young Robert Duvall, told the eerie story of a lonely man who becomes obsessed with a miniature dollhouse at a museum, believing the figures inside it are alive. The episode aired in 1963 and was pulled from syndication shortly after due to a copyright dispute. The estate of writer Charles Beaumont had licensed the episode for one-time broadcast, but claimed CBS didn't secure the proper long-term rights. As a result, Miniature vanished from rerun packages for decades, despite being well received at the time of its release. It wasn't restored until the early 2000s, when legal issues were resolved and it was included in a DVD box set. The fact that this quiet, psychological drama about alienation was unavailable for so long says less about its content and more about how fragile creative ownership was in early television. Then there's A Short Drink from a Certain Fountain, which aired in December of 1963. It tells the story of a middle-aged man married to a much younger woman who pressures him into taking an experimental youth serum. It works too well. The man regresses into childhood, leaving his wife trapped in a role she never asked for. The episode was pulled from syndication for years because of legal threats. The details of the dispute remain unclear, but some accounts suggest the plot bore too close a resemblance to an unproduced script written by someone else, possibly resulting in claims of plagiarism. Rather than risk a lawsuit, CBS kept it out of rotation entirely. Sounds and Silences was a more direct case. The episode follows a man obsessed with loud noises who ends up suffering a mental breakdown when he begins to hear everything at excruciating volume. The story while exaggerated in classic Twilight Zone style, mirrors real-world conditions like hyperacusis, a form of extreme sound sensitivity. After the episode aired, a former Navy man sued CBS, claiming the story portrayed him in a defamatory way and was based on his life without consent. To avoid further legal entanglements, the network dropped the episode from reruns. It wasn't until much later that it was quietly reintroduced on home media, with no official apology or clarification. Finally, there's an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Unlike the others, this episode wasn't written by Serling or his team at all. It was actually a French short film, directed by Robert Enrico and adapted from the Ambrose Bierce short story of the same name. CBS purchased the rights to air the film as a special episode of The Twilight Zone in 1964. It was a bold move. No narration, no new footage, just a foreign production dropped into the middle of an American sci-fi anthology series. The episode follows a Confederate sympathizer who is about to be hanged, only to seemingly escape and run for his life, until the twist reveals the entire escape was a hallucination in the final moments before death. Despite its powerful impact and an Academy Award for Best Short Film, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge was only aired once. The licensing agreement allowed CBS to broadcast the episode a single time. After that, it was out of circulation for years, and many fans didn't even know it existed. It eventually returned in some home video editions, but the strange distribution history kept it from being part of the cultural memory in the same way as other episodes. What ties these lost episodes together is not just legal or contractual complication. It's the broader issue of control. Who decides what stories get remembered? Who decides what stories get buried? Rod Serling fought these battles for years. He was exhausted by how often scripts had to be rewritten, softened, stripped of political meaning just to pass through sponsor review. He once said that his job as a writer had become the art of self-censorship. That line wasn't a joke. Serling constantly had to find workarounds, disguising critiques of racism, fascism, or xenophobia as ghost stories or space missions because he knew direct attacks wouldn't survive. The result was a series that always walked a razor's edge. When The Twilight Zone was airing live, Serling had more leverage. But once the show was over, the episodes entered a different system, one ruled by syndication deals, local stations, and advertisers with no tolerance for ambiguity. Controversial themes, unresolved moral conflicts, or lawsuits, even unconfirmed ones, were treated as liabilities. Today, we're still having that same debate. Only the language has changed. We don't talk as much about syndication anymore. Now, it's about streaming platforms, brand safety, and content flags. But the central issue remains the same. What makes a piece of art too risky to show? And who gets to make that call? In recent years, debates around cancel culture and media censorship have reignited across the political spectrum. Some argue that removing offensive content is necessary to protect vulnerable communities. Others claim that erasing problematic work prevents difficult conversations. In reality, both can be true, and The Twilight Zone, especially its banned or suppressed episodes, sits right at the center of that tension. Serling's brilliance was not in providing solutions. It was in making viewers uncomfortable enough to ask better questions. And censorship, even when well-intentioned, often short-circuits that process. When the encounter was pulled, viewers lost the chance to wrestle with a story about intergenerational trauma and moral gray zones. When sounds and silences was buried, we lost a unique take on psychological vulnerability. When Owl Creek Bridge was shelved, we lost an experimental narrative that played with time and perception in ways modern shows are only now catching up to. The irony is that many of these banned episodes aren't especially extreme by today's standards. They're quiet, complex, sometimes sad. But they ask questions networks still hesitate to touch. What if the enemy is someone who looks like your neighbor? What if your hero isn't so heroic? What if justice isn't about winning, but about admitting you were wrong? The Twilight Zone has never really left. It's just evolved. In 2019, Jordan Peele revived the series for CBS All Access, bringing modern production value and socially conscious themes to a new generation. While reviews were mixed, it reignited public interest in Serling's legacy. In 2025, writer Dan Watters is set to release a new Twilight Zone comic through IDW, promising original stories that echo the show's eerie moral tone. And in a surprising move, Ben Stiller is now developing a feature-length Twilight Zone film about a fighter pilot who jumps forward in time by 125 years. This modern resurgence isn't just about nostalgia, it's about timing. Audiences today are hungry for stories that blend moral uncertainty with unsettling realism. Shows like Black Mirror and Severance follow the Serling model, present the familiar, distort it just slightly, and force viewers to confront uncomfortable truths. In that context, the encounter is no longer dismissed as too controversial. It's understood as a necessary story, raw but honest. Serling's voice still echoes, not just through reruns, but through the artists now carrying his work forward, using new platforms to ask the same hard questions. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.